Hello, and welcome to Memory Card. My name is Ben Bertoli.
And my name is Push Dustin.
And we're here to illuminate some weird and wonderful gaming history.
Every episode, one of us will take on the role of the expert and describe the story behind an interesting character, game, console, or accessory.
And there may be some episodes where we're both the expert, or a guest expert stops by. This podcast is a bit of an experiment, so we're just going to have fun with it. Are you ready, Push?
Ready.
Okay, let's boot up episode 1. This is Ben, and I am the expert on this very first episode. And for our initial episode, our pilot, we're going to talk about this very underground, indie title that you've probably never heard of. It's called Pokemon.
Oh, I've never heard of that.
You never heard of that one, Push?
No, never.
Of course not. Of course not. So, Pokemon, for those of you who don't know, and it's weird if you don't, but that's fine, is basically a series of games for the Nintendo handheld systems developed by Game Freak, where you catch monsters and you trade them and you battle them and you try and earn gym badges and you go on magical adventures.
Mm-hmm.
So, Push, what's your background with Pokemon? Did you play the games right from the start, or when did you jump on the bandwagon there?
So I'm the type of Pokemon fan that a lot of Pokemon fans hate. Like, I have a lot of experience with the Kanto region, the very first ones. I think they're red, blue, yellow. In Japan, it was green. Then I kind of stopped playing Pokemon for, several years. And I didn't get back to Pokemon until Black and White. So I had that huge gap of knowledge, actually, with Pokemon. With Black and White, I got back into it, partly because they were pandering to the Kanto region fans like myself. And then I played a little bit of Sun and Moon. Oh, and X and Y.
I kind of had that lull, too. I was huge into Red and Blue when they first launched in America. And then Gold and Silver, I was way into those. And then I kind of lost a little bit after that with, I think it was Ruby and Sapphire or something, the Game Boy Advance era. I think I've played every main series, at least one of the entries since it initially began. And I mean, right off the bat, Pokemon, I mean, the original craze, I was patient zero at my elementary school. I'm pretty sure I was the first one to introduce Pokemon cards. I'm probably the reason why they got banned from the school. And in an unfortunate accident, I taped over my little brother's ultrasound with an episode of Pokemon.
Oh, no.
That was not on purpose. I just grabbed a tape and I said, this looks blank enough, and I put it in. And it was, I distinctly remember it because my mother was extremely angry with me because, that was a one-of-a-kind thing.
Yep.
But also because it was the episode where Pikachu fights Raichu, which is very iconic, right?
Yeah, it's a very good episode.
So Pokemon, is kind of this huge, it is the biggest media franchise in the world. So let me set the scene here for kind of the start of this, because, Pokemon is not a story that people don't know. It's a pretty common one, but I feel like there's one Pokemon that kind of stands out that people don't know as much about as they maybe think they do.
Yeah.
Let me set the scene. Tokyo, late 1980s, and there's a new magazine that's come out by these avid video game fans, and it's called Game Freak.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the start of Game Freak, the development company. They began as a magazine. They got hand-drawn pictures, and they, everything. It's kind of like you're going to run down to Kinko's, make a couple of copies and sell them, at the local bookstore, that kind of thing. They eventually become an actual development company, obviously, for Sega and for Nintendo. And do you know what year the development of Pokemon actually began? Take a guess.
I know it's way longer than it was because it was in development hell for such a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was 91.
Close, 1990.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, that, it's one of the very first projects that they get into is this thing that they called Capsule Monsters. And they pitched it to Nintendo, and Nintendo's like, no, that won't sell. We don't want that. So the original two games, Red and Green, like you mentioned before, they came out in February of 1996. But the planning and development for the series actually began all the way back in 1990, which was right after the commercial release for the Game Boy itself, which was in the spring of 1989.
Mm-hmm.
So they were like, "Ooh, there's this hot new toy that's out, and we're gonna, take advantage of it." And then, it takes them 6 years, like you said, they were stuck in development hell there for a long time. even their original release date was supposed to be in December of 1995, and they didn't hit that. And so the people at Game Freak were, for lack of better terms, freaking out because they thought that the Game Boy was kind of like passé. Like, oh, no one's going to want to play this anymore. Like, this is outdated tech. You know, we've waited too long.
Mm-hmm.
And then the original 2 games came out, and they did okay. Like, for the first few months, they weren't like some grand slam, you know, out of the gates, amazing hit that we know them as today.
Yeah.
The biggest thing the games had going for them was basically that there was this co-op type of feel because of the 2 versions where you had to trade and battle if you wanted to get the full experience. What was your color of choice at the beginning there, Push?
I was a blue.
Oh man, I was a red, so it's perfect, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, we could trade and we could get all 150.
What was your favorite Pokemon from the original generation?
It's a mix between Jolteon and Mew.
Man, my favorite's Snorlax.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know why. I just like, I think I like his attitude of laying around and sleeping all day.
Yeah.
Even though I've never been a very large person, you know, like I've never been a very hefty person. I liked his swagger.
I love the icons for Snorlax over the games. Like, they've slowly been standing up.
Right, yeah. He started out on the ground in a very lethargic position, and slowly he's getting to his feet. It just took him, 15, 20 years. I can relate. That's how I feel every morning. You said your favorite Pokemon was Mew, and Mew was the 151st Pokemon. It was the hidden one.
Yep.
So if you were going to describe what Mew looked like to someone who had never seen it, how would you describe Mew?
Kind of like a cat. Like an alien cat.
Space cat.
Yep.
Yeah, right?
So back in those early days, 1990, when Game Freak was developing this Capsule Monsters or Pocket Monsters game, they were trying to apply these trademarks to everything, like they didn't want people to steal their intellectual property. And the very first Pokemon to ever be submitted for an official trademark was, you want to take a guess?
Was it Mew?
It was Mew. Yeah, it was Mew. And Mew's kind of the Pokemon that I want to talk about today, just because, I guess a lot of people don't realize like how far back Mew goes and how it was kind of like, it was so influential in helping Pokemon. Before they even registered Pocket Monsters, like the title, or Pikachu, or Jigglypuff, there was Mew, like from the very start, this little cuddly pink space cat with huge eyes. Is Mew pink? Mew's pink, right?
Mew is pink, I believe.
I'm colorblind, so I just want to double check. I've made that mistake before in the past, assuming that I knew what colors things were. So basically, back when Nintendo president Satoru Iwata was the bigwig, the guy in charge, and I will say right now, terrible at pronouncing Japanese names.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah, that's why you're there. You're my translator guy. So he sat down with Ishihara, I believe it was, who's like the CEO of the Pokemon company, and Morimoto, and they talked about the initial launch of Red and Green and how it was so hectic.
Yep.
And Ishihara said in a quote that there's no denying that Mew's existence played an extremely significant role in the launch of the series. And basically what happened was they had gone through and they had this debug mode that was on the cartridge, and they knew that there was going to be space when they took it off because they're not going to leave that on there for the consumer. So they have these 300 bytes of free space, and they thought, oh, you know what? Let's secretly slide this extra Pokemon like onto the cartridge without telling people. Like, Nintendo didn't know. Most of the developers at Game Freak didn't know. It was just this handful of people who were like, hey, this is a good idea, which is completely reckless. Like nowadays, if you went through and debugged the game and then you dropped like an extra bit of content on there, that could be...
Yeah, without testing it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a terrible, terrible idea because it could go horribly wrong. Yeah, so they kind of dropped it on there, and, all 3 of them basically said, it was more of like an inside joke. They didn't even think they were actually going to be able to use it. It was kind of like a prank. Like, hey, guess what? We put this in there. We didn't tell you guys, but it's on there. So yeah, and they basically thought it would stay a secret and be hidden from the players. But what happened was when it launched, eventually like some games glitched. People wandered into some weird areas, and then like Mew somehow became available. And so they were like, okay, we're gonna admit that we know that this thing exists. And in the April 1996 edition of CoroCoro Comics, they basically said, okay, we're going to give 20 people this awesome legendary Pokemon. if you win, you send us your cartridge, we put it on there, and we send it back to you, which is such a weird and novel idea at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So how many people do you think entered that contest? So they're saying, hey, we have 20 of this special Pokemon, write in. How many people do you think entered it?
Probably 1,000?
More.
10,000.
78,000 people.
Oh, wow.
Or children or adults who were super into Pokemon. Which is the thing, like Pokemon, like I said, it kind of had a slow start. So at this point, it was picking up momentum, but it was this contest that was like, you can have this specific thing that no one else can have. Well, 20 other people in the world are going to have.
Yeah.
So at that point, Pokemon like takes off. Thanks to Mew in this contest, it like makes the news, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, Pokemon is the game to have.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you know the background of Mew? In the original games, do you remember what Mew's background is?
Like, Mew gave birth to Mewtwo on like February something, I believe.
Yeah, so basically like Mewtwo, which is such an original name, basically, is the second Mew. But the weirdest thing about the description for Mew is that even in the game, it says that Mew was discovered in the jungles of Guyana, which is a real place.
Yeah.
Which, as far as I can tell, as far as my detailed Pokemon research has found, there's not any other Pokemon that's like linked to a real world location, which is pretty significant because I've always imagined that Pokemon is like its own world. It's like its own thing. Kanto is based on an actual part of Japan, right?
Yeah.
And then there's like France and there's America,
New York City.
Yeah, that kind of thing. But like, where is Guyana? Where does it fall within the Pokemon world? Is it the same as our Guyana? It's just very strange that South America somehow exists also in this world.
Have you ever read that like fan fiction of Pokemon takes place after like a huge war?
No, I haven't. What's the general overview on that?
Basically, there's like a nuclear holocaust.
Oh gosh.
And like a huge battle that like wiped out a lot of people. This is like why there's like so many people without fathers in the Pokemon game.
Oh no.
Because they just all died in war, and these Pokemon are a result of mutation from the atomic bombs.
Oh gosh. Oh, so like Pokemon are like mutants.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I when I look at a Machamp, I think that used to be a dude, right? Like
that's probably Ash's dad.
Yeah. No, I think it's Mr. Mime, right? Isn't that the fan theory? Oh Lord. So yeah, so Mew is launched and has this, weird background. And when it comes to America, people are obviously reading about it and they know that Mew exists, but once again, like, there is no magazine giveaway at that point. Mew is just some like legendary thing. And Pokemon has always been a series where people, thought, oh, if you did this, if you walk this way and turn and then fly, it's like the missing no glitch.
Yeah.
There was rumors of you could get out if you push the truck next to the SSN, you would get Mew.
I do have a confession. The first website I started was actually a Pokemon website, and it was called Thunder Punch. After Electabuzz's move, I would write those rumors. Like, I wouldn't write, like, make them up. I would, like, post a collection of them.
Gotcha.
Like, this is how you get the Pokegods.
I distinctly remember someone did, like, a Photoshop of, like, a bunch of Starmies or Staryus together, and it was like, if you want to get Star-Us, and I was like, Star-Us? I'm like, whoa. I can't believe it. Like, what an amazing name. I can't remember what amazing thing you had to do to get Star-Us, or Pika Blue was another one.
Yeah. Yep. Mew 3.
Oh, Mew 3. Right, yeah. Can't forget about Mew 3. I'm still surprised that there's not a Mew 3 yet. That seems like something that Nintendo would have done by now. Or Game Freak, I should say. So, the first time, even before Pokemon comes out in America, in the January 98 issue of Nintendo Power, Nintendo used to have a thing called Space World, if you remember. It's basically like their own little E3. And so they're showing off like Zelda 64, and Super Mario RPG 2, and the Nintendo 64 disc drive, like the future of entertainment here.
Yeah.
There was only 2 Pokemon they mentioned by name, and one was Pikachu, and the other was Mew, but they spelled it differently than it is spelled today. They spelled it Myuu.
Yeah, and the reason that it's Myuu for that event is because that's how it's spelled in Japanese.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense then. At this point, Nintendo was like, okay, 78,000 people who wanted Mew, we're going to give you a chance here. And there was 100,000 Mews were given away at Space World 97, which is insane because that means people had to actually come up with their cartridge and put it into like the special Mew machine, and then they gave it to them. But this is like a mecca. We're going to drive to Space World.
I do have a random factoid about the Space World Mew event. Do you know the trainer name for those Mews?
The trainer name?
Yeah.
No, I do not. Like the one that shows up in the Pokedex?
Yeah, it would be like Yoshi and like Mario, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's pretty fun. I guess that would be a nice little like nod in there, right? Did you watch the Pokemon cartoon series when it came out?
Yeah, I watched it when I was growing up, yeah.
And so obviously, I bet you remember, you know, those first like opening drum beats, like, dun, 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 you know, I want to be the very best. You saw Mew and Mewtwo like fly through the sky.
Yep.
They used Mew and Mewtwo as like the big pull, even though Pikachu was the face of it, for the very first Pokemon movie. So Pokemon the movie comes out in 1999, and this is the same year that Nintendo is finally like, okay, people who live in, you know, not Japan, we're going to give you the chance to go get Mew. And they did like a Toys R Us thing where you could come and get it on a special day at certain Toys R Us. And I think there was a Nintendo Power giveaway. And there was even some like a traveling Pokemon training league tour that offered, you know, Mew to select winners if you won, that kind of thing. Looking back, I never thought Mew was like that big a deal. Like I wanted Mew, and at some point I went down a very dark path in my life, and I used a Game Shark to get Mew. And I felt so bad about it that I immediately just traded it away to someone else who wanted it.
I did use a Game Shark to start off with a Mew. One playthrough. I did like 3 or 4 playthroughs of Pokemon Blue.
So this was when you were a kid, not later on in life?
Yeah, when I was a kid.
Oh, okay.
Pokemon Blue was like one of my favorite games. And I had a Game Shark, so I was just like, you know, I'm just going to start off with a Mew and go through the whole story like that. And that was pretty fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. Although was that Mew like pretty powerful considering?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because it could learn any move. So.
Yeah, exactly. Brock and Misty stand no chance.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's the skinny on Mew. This adorable monster that was there from the very beginning was added into the games at the last second, pretty much as a literal inside joke. Mew helped build hype around Pokemon in the early days and kept the craze of catching them all alive for quite some time after launch, with appearances in shows and movies and card games.
I guess you could say of all the legendary Pokemon, Mew is probably the most legendary.
Absolutely.
That's all from us for now. Thanks for listening to our very first episode.
We'd like to give a special shout out to Game Boy chiptune master Jamitar, who allowed us to use his track Midori as opening and closing music. You can find more of his banging beats by searching Jamitar, that's Jamatar, on Spotify, or visiting jamitar.com.
If you have any feedback on the podcast or want to recommend a topic, feel free to reach out to us via Twitter. Ben can be found at Super Bentendo, and I can be found at Push Dust In.
Be on the lookout for episode 2 dropping soon.
See ya.